It was December 12th, 2016, a cold winter night in the small town of Fairbrook, Pennsylvania. In a two-story house on Maple Drive, Samira Khan sat in her dimly lit living room, the only sound the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. Her fingers tapped nervously on her phone screen as she scrolled through old messages, a mix of guilt and longing pulling at her heart. Her husband, Rashid, a successful surgeon known for his dedication and sharp mind, had left for a medical conference in Philadelphia earlier that morning. Samira, 38, had spent the day attending to their two young daughters and running errands. But now that night had fallen, she felt restless. She thought of Amir Malik, the 26-year-old architect she'd met at a community event 6 months prior. Amir was bold, with a confident smile and easy laughter that made her forget for brief moments the expectations and pressures she felt every day. But Amir wasn't the only one. Just 2 weeks ago, she'd met Leo Thompson, a 29-year-old fitness instructor with an adventurous streak. His intense gaze and deep conversations had drawn her in, and the whirlwind of emotions Samira felt in his presence made her feel alive, despite the risks. As the clock struck 9:15 p.m., a message from Amir appeared on her phone. "Can I see you tonight?" Just for a moment. Samira's chest tightened as she glanced at the empty hallway. The girls were asleep, and the house was wrapped in a fragile silence. Against her better judgment, she typed, "Come by at 10. The wind outside howled as Amir pulled up in his black sedan, parking a block away to avoid suspicion. Samira opened the door quietly, letting him in, and they sat in the living room, speaking in low voices. The thrill of their secret was intoxicating, but Samira couldn't shake the feeling that it was too quiet, as if the house itself was holding its breath. At 10:35 p.m., the silence was broken by the faint sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Samira's blood ran cold as she realized it was Rashid's car. He wasn't supposed to be back until tomorrow. Her pulse quickened as Amir stood up, eyes wide with panic. "You need to leave. Now," Samira whispered urgently, ushering him toward the back door. But the sound of Rashid's key turning in the front lock sent a wave of dread crashing over her. Rashid stepped into the house, his expression neutral as he set down his bag and looked up. His eyes moved from Samira's face to Amir, who stood frozen in the hallway, unable to hide. The air grew thick, heavy with an unspoken truth that twisted the room into a suffocating space. "Who is this?" Rashid's voice was calm, too calm, and Samira knew they were far past explanations. Rashid's gaze shifted between Samira and Amir, taking in every detail, the flushed look on Samira's face, the tension in Amir's rigid stance, the guilt that hung thick in the air. He was a man of logic, a surgeon used to solving complex problems with precision. But at this moment, the pieces were too surreal to fit together neatly. "Who is this?" Rashid repeated, his voice steady, though a sharp edge had crept in. Amir opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Samira stepped forward, her breath unsteady. "Rashid, I can explain," she started, but even she didn't believe the words as they left her lips. The reality of what was happening crashed down on her with brutal force. "Explain." Rashid's eyes locked onto hers, searching for the wife he thought he knew. "I come home to find a man in my house. What is there to explain?" Amir shifted uncomfortably, taking a small step backward, as if that would somehow remove him from the equation. His mind raced, desperate for an escape. "I should go," he said, breaking the tense silence. He moved quickly toward the back door, but Rashid stepped in his path, blocking his exit with a sudden, fierce motion. "You're not going anywhere," Rashid said, the sharpness in his voice making Amir flinch. The air between the three of them grew thick with unspoken accusations and buried truths. Samira's heartbeat pounded in her ears, drowning out every coherent thought. The room felt smaller, suffocating. "Please, Rashid, let him leave." Samira's voice wavered. She reached out, but Rashid's expression stopped her cold. It was no longer the face of a husband. It was that of a man betrayed, a storm brewing behind his eyes. He turned to Amir, his fists clenched at his sides. "Who are you to her?" Rashid asked, his voice low, dangerous. Amir swallowed hard, glancing at Samira, who stood paralyzed, her eyes wide with fear. He knew there was no way out that didn't involve pain, no words that could smooth over what had already been revealed. "I'm a friend," Amir stammered, though even he knew the lie was thin and transparent. "A friend," Rashid echoed, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Friends don't sneak into people's homes in the middle of the night." He stepped closer, the space between him and Amir shrinking to mere inches. Amir's breath quickened, panic clawing at his chest. "Rashid, please!" Samira's voice broke, the rawness of her guilt cutting through the air. But Rashid didn't move, his eyes locked on Amir like a predator sizing up his prey. The silence that followed was deafening, a tense pause that seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Suddenly, a noise from upstairs, one of the girls shifting in her sleep, snapped the tension like a whip. Amir took the moment to push past Rashid, slipping out the back door before anyone could react. The cold night air hit him like a slap as he ran to his car, not daring to look back. He started the engine with shaking hands and drove off, the image of Rashid's eyes burned into his mind. Inside the house, Rashid turned to Samira, the fury that had held him in place now simmering into something colder, something more dangerous. "How long?" he asked, each word weighted with betrayal. Samira's voice caught in her throat. There was no point in lying now. "A few months," she whispered, tears beginning to blur her vision. She wiped them away quickly, as if trying to erase the evidence of her guilt. Rashid's jaw tightened, his face a mask of disbelief and pain. "How could you?" he said, the question more to himself than to her. The woman in front of him was no longer the Samira he had built a life with. She was someone else, someone he didn't recognize. The seconds passed slowly, each one heavier than the last. Finally Rashid spoke again, his voice hollow. "Do they know? The girls?" His eyes flickered with worry, the fatherly instinct momentarily overtaking the wounded husband. "No," Samira said, her voice cracking. "They don't know anything. I never wanted this, Rashid. I never meant to." Her words fell flat, the weight of their meaning buried beneath the reality of what she had done. Rashid turned away, running a hand through his hair, his mind racing with what to do next. He felt trapped, boxed in by the walls of a house that now felt foreign, every photo and piece of furniture mocking him with memories of a life that suddenly seemed like a lie. "I'm staying at a hotel tonight," he said finally, his voice devoid of emotion. "We'll talk in the morning." Without waiting for a response, he grabbed his coat and keys, leaving Samira standing alone, the echo of the closing door resonating through the silent house. As Rashid drove away, his phone buzzed in the cup holder. He ignored it, eyes focused straight ahead, but when it buzzed a second time, he glanced at the screen. The name made his heart clench. Leo Thompson. He had no idea who the man was, but tonight had taught him one thing. There was more to Samira's secrets than he had imagined. Back at the house, Samira sat on the couch, numb. She stared at her phone, where a message from Leo waited unread. "I miss you. When can we see each other again?" Rashid sat in his hotel room, staring at the unread message from Leo Thompson. The name gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't reach. The room was silent, except for the dull hum of the heater, and in that quiet, his mind played out scenarios, each worse than the last. One man in his home was devastating enough, but the possibility of another. The betrayal deepened with every thought. He opened his laptop and searched the name. The first result showed Leo's profile as a local fitness instructor at a popular gym just outside Fairbrook. Rashid's fingers hovered over the keys before he clicked on the profile. Photos of Leo flooded the screen. Group fitness classes, motivational posts, pictures with clients. One image, however, caught Rashid's eye. Leo standing next to Samira, both smiling under the bright gym lights. The caption read, "Training with one of our best members, Samira, always inspiring." The room seemed to close in around him. His vision tunneled as anger roared in his ears. The betrayal was no longer just an affair. It was a web of deceit that stretched further than he'd ever imagined. The next morning, Rashid didn't return home. Instead, he drove to the gym, parking across the street where he had a clear view of the entrance. He waited, eyes fixed on the glass doors, his pulse hammering in his chest. At 10:45 a.m., Leo emerged, talking animatedly with a colleague. Rashid's jaw clenched as he watched Leo laugh, completely unaware of the storm brewing. Rashid's phone buzzed, breaking his focus. It was Samira, calling for the fourth time that morning. He silenced it, his eyes locked on Leo as the fitness instructor walked to his car, waving goodbye to a co-worker. The moment Leo's car pulled out of the lot, Rashid started his engine and followed, keeping a safe distance. Leo's car turned into a small, quiet neighborhood, parking in the driveway of a single-story house. Rashid parked a few houses down and watched as Leo walked up to the door and disappeared inside. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He had to know. He needed answers. Without giving himself time to second-guess, Rashid got out of his car and walked to Leo's house. He rang the doorbell, each second stretching longer than the last. The door opened, and Leo stood there surprised but not alarmed. "Can I help you?" he asked, eyes narrowing in curiosity. Rashid's voice was low, steady. "We need to talk. It's about Samira." Leo's expression shifted from confusion to recognition, and then to unease. He opened the door wider, stepping aside to let Rashid in. The house was modest, with fitness equipment tucked into one corner of the living room and motivational posters on the walls. Leo motioned for Rashid to sit, but Rashid remained standing, his eyes fixed on the younger man. "I know you know her," Rashid began, his voice tight with controlled anger. "What I don't know is why, or for how long." Leo took a deep breath, running a hand through his short hair. "Look, if you're here to fight, there's nothing to fight about," he said, his tone defensive but cautious. "I didn't know she was still married. She told me it was complicated, that things were ending." Rashid felt the words like a blow to his chest. He staggered slightly, gripping the back of a chair for support. "How long?" he demanded, eyes burning with betrayal. Leo looked down, guilt flickering across his face. "About 2 months," he said quietly. "It started out as just training sessions, but it turned into more." Rashid's breath came in short, sharp bursts. He glanced around the room, the evidence of Leo's life blurring as rage threatened to take over. "She's been lying to both of us," he muttered, more to himself than to Leo. Leo's expression shifted from guilt to concern. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. If I had known—" Rashid cut him off, his eyes flashing. "You think that matters? You think any of this makes sense now? You've helped tear apart my family." The words came out like venom, and Leo flinched. Before either man could say more, the doorbell rang, startling them both. Leo frowned, walking cautiously to the door and peering through the window. His eyes widened, and he turned back to Rashid. "It's her." Rashid's heart stopped. Samira stood on the porch, shifting from foot to foot, her eyes glancing nervously at the street. Leo stepped back, as if unsure of what to do, but Rashid moved past him and opened the door. Samira's eyes met Rashid's, and she froze, the color draining from her face. The air crackled with tension as the reality of the situation settled around them like a storm. "Rashid, what are you doing here?" she whispered. her voice trembling. "I should be asking you that," Rashid replied, the calmness in his voice almost scarier than his anger. "How many more lies, Samira? How many more men?" Tears welled up in Samira's eyes, but she blinked them away, glancing between Rashid and Leo. The silence that followed was suffocating, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." Leo stepped forward, looking at both of them. "This is out of control. We need to stop this before it gets worse." Rashid's eyes narrowed, the rage simmering beneath the surface. "Worse? You think it can't get worse?" He turned to Samira, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Tell me, Samira, did you ever think about what this would do to us? To the girls?" Samira's face crumpled, and she sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. The weight of her choices, the lies, and the consequences pressed down on her, leaving her speechless. The room fell silent, the three of them trapped in a web of betrayal that had no easy way out. The silence that settled over the room was fragile, like glass waiting to shatter. Rashid stood rigid, his eyes darting between Samira and Leo, as if searching for the last piece of a puzzle he didn't want to solve. Samira sat in the chair, her face pale and drawn, eyes fixed on the floor, as if it might somehow offer her redemption. Leo leaned against the wall, his hands clenched into fists as tension rippled through his body. "Why, Samira?" Rashid finally spoke, his voice raw, each word cutting through the room like a knife. "Was it not enough? Was I not enough?" The pain in his voice cracked something in Samira, and she lifted her gaze to meet his, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It wasn't you, Rashid," she said, her voice trembling. "I was lost, and I made terrible choices, but it was never about you not being enough. It was about me, feeling trapped, feeling like I was disappearing." Rashid's expression flickered between anger and heartbreak. He took a step back, running a hand over his face as if trying to wipe away the reality before him. "You had a family, a life. Was that not worth fighting for?" Samira opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She couldn't defend herself, not when the truth was laid so bare. The silence was punctuated by the muffled sound of a car driving past outside, the world moving on as theirs fell apart. Leo cleared his throat, breaking the standoff. "I think I should go," he said, his voice strained, and he moved toward the door. But before he could reach it, Rashid blocked his path. "No," Rashid said, his eyes darkening. "You don't get to walk away, not after all this." Leo's jaw tightened, and for the first time, a spark of defiance appeared in his eyes. "I'm not the only one to blame here, Rashid. We all made choices, ones we'll regret, but standing here pointing fingers won't fix anything." The words hung in the air, and Rashid's hands shook with barely contained fury. He wanted to lash out, to channel the storm inside him into something tangible, something that would make this pain feel less hollow. But as he looked at Leo, then back at Samira, the weight of it all pressed down on him like an iron vice. "I don't care about blame anymore," Rashid said, voice breaking. "I just care that everything I believed in is gone." Samira stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. "I know there's nothing I can say to make this right," she whispered, stepping closer to Rashid. "But I'm willing to try, for us, for the girls." Rashid's eyes softened for a moment, the father in him fighting against the betrayed husband. But the memory of that night, the way Amir had stood in their home, and Leo's name on her phone, burned too brightly in his mind. Leo took a deep breath, sensing the tension was at its peak. "Rashid, listen." "No." Rashid's voice was sharp, final. "I've heard enough from you." He turned to Samira, his face etched with pain. "I'll come home for the girls. But as for us, I don't know if there's anything left." Samira's tears fell freely, her fingers trembling as she reached for Rashid's hand, but he pulled away. The emptiness that followed his movement felt like a chasm between them, vast and unbridgeable. Leo exhaled, his eyes darting between them, unsure if he should leave or stay. The tension in the room seemed to coil tighter, suffocating. Then suddenly the front door burst open, and Amir stepped inside, his eyes wild, his breath labored as if he had run the entire way. "I couldn't stay away," he said, ignoring the stunned silence. His eyes locked onto Rashid, then shifted to Samira. "I need to explain." Rashid's composure snapped, rage boiling over. "Explain? Explain what, Amir? That you thought you could take my life, my family, and just walk away unscathed?" Amir took a step forward, hands raised. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't know it would come to this." Leo moved between them, sensing the danger. "This isn't the time, Amir. Leave now." But Rashid pushed past Leo, grabbing Amir by the collar. "You show up here after everything, after you broke my family apart?" The room erupted in chaos, Samira screaming for them to stop, Leo trying to pull Rashid away. Amir struggled against Rashid's grip, his voice strained. "I didn't mean to hurt you. It was never supposed to be like this." The shouts turned to silence when the glint of metal caught everyone's attention. Leo had pushed Rashid back, but in the scuffle, an object had fallen from Amir's pocket, a small, sleek knife. It clattered to the floor, the sound echoing through the tense space. Rashid's eyes darted between the knife and Amir. "Why do you have that?" he whispered, the fury in his eyes now mixed with disbelief. Amir's face drained of color as he realized what had happened. "I brought it for protection," he said weakly, "in case things got out of hand." The tension snapped, and before anyone could react, Rashid lunged for the knife, his expression one of raw emotion. Samira screamed, Leo shouted, but Rashid paused, staring down at the weapon in his hand. The room held its collective breath as realization set in. Rashid's shoulders slumped, the fight leaving him in an instant. He dropped the knife. It clattered once more against the floor, and he stepped back, his eyes now full of exhaustion rather than rage. He looked at Samira, Amir, and Leo, and saw not just betrayal, but broken, flawed people, just like him. "We're done here," Rashid said, his voice hollow. He turned, walked out the front door, and didn't look back. The sound of the door closing was final, like the end of a long, painful chapter. In the silence that followed, Samira sank to her knees. Leo placed a trembling hand on her shoulder, and Amir stood frozen, haunted by what could have been.